how to safely use it. If you're playing a video game, your character might just pick up a gun and start firing at random. There's no training for how you're going to handle it like you would have in real life. This important step is often bypassed and makes guns seem trivial, and we need to return to seeing guns as tools which should be respected, not toys which can be used inconsequentially. It's clear that those who committed the shootings which led to this panel did not treat guns as tools, nor respect them. I'm sure that many of you know, students I mean at least, people who play a few hundred hours of Call of Duty and seem to think that they are experts on guns. They know the make, they know the bullet, they know the power, but they've never actually fired it, but they claim to be experts. There have been numerous calls for video games or movies to be restricted in the wake of shootings such as Sandy Hook and Aurora, Colorado, and 3 pieces of legislation on that topic were proposed in Congress. However, all those pieces of legislation have since been taken off the table. Although there's currently no scientific data which links violence in video games or movies to violence that occurs in real life or gun violence, it can certainly be seen that there's correlation. In fact, New Jersey Governor Chris Christie recently asked the state legislature to pass a bill which would require minors purchasing mature-rated video games to do so with parental consent. Of course, there are many other measures which we can take to restrict gun violence. This could be background checks, ammunition restrictions, or clip sizes. However, all these are hotly debated and rather partisan. I think that the best first step is to encourage an environment of respect and less violence, which is a good start that all Americans will appreciate and allow us to move forward respectfully with this conversation about the future of how to restrict and prevent gun violence. Thank you.
My name is Jeff Carpenter. I'm faculty in the School of Education. Schools must be safe places. Our nation's children must be able to focus on learning and not worry about violence. Mass shootings draw a great deal of attention to school safety, but have yet to prompt actions that make these tragedies a thing of the past. The Columbine shootings occurred in 1999, but as the years pass, we have seen more tragedies such as Virginia Tech and Newtown. Recently, the National Rifle Association sponsored a study of school safety that recommends the voluntary arming of selected school employees. I reject the idea that arming more adults in our schools is good for our children. An armed sheriff's deputy was present at Columbine High School and did not prevent that tragedy. And the presence of police and or armed guards in schools is not without costs. Do we raise a generation that believes guns everywhere equals safety? How long will it be before there's an accident or misuse of guns if they are commonplace in schools? There is already evidence that the very presence of police in schools can have negative consequences for some students whose adolescent misbehavior becomes treated as criminal behavior. Instead of this fight fire with fire approach, we need a more long-term and comprehensive strategy for addressing the mental and emotional health of our students and school communities. Guidance counselors are overwhelmed with responsibility for hundreds of students and cannot provide much actual counseling. School psychologists are similarly spread thin, and standardized testing pressures mean teachers spend less time teaching character and nurturing the kinds of relationships with students that can be powerful deterrents to violence. The real solution to the epidemic of violence in our country is in the long, hard, and unglamorous work of developing our children's relationships, mental health, and characters. Second, in the short term, we do need better gun regulation in this country. Contrast our inaction with what happened in the United Kingdom in the wake of the Delaplane school massacre in 1996. The UK adopted some of the most restrictive gun legislation in the world. And meanwhile in the US, shooting after shooting failed to result in better gun control. I'm not even advocating for the level of restrictions that were created in the wake of the Delaplane massacre. I simply suggest that some more regulation is needed. We consent to the government regulating things such as ladders, seat belts, and speed limits in order to increase safety. There are even certain raw cheeses that are banned in our country. If we can have cheese regulation, can we please have gun regulation that is a little more effective? 12 years ago, there was one failed shoe bomb attempt, and ever since, we've been taking off our shoes to go through airport security. Surely we can accept some inconveniences and restrictions on gun purchasing and use when on average there are more than 30,000 gun fatalities per year in the United States. Let's take action so that 10 years from now, we can look back and see that something good came out of the Newtown tragedy and that schools became safer places as a result. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Emily Delaplane, and I am a member of the class of 2014. As a Human Service Studies and Public Health Studies double major, I'm going to speak very briefly about the impact of gun violence on the health system and the overall population health, in hopes to persuade you that we do need to improve our gun laws. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 2010, of the 180,000 injury-related deaths, almost 32,000 were a result of firearms. It is unclear as to whether these were a result of gun violence or suicide and unintentional incidents, but of the 16,000 homicides in 2010, 11,000 of those were related to firearms. The Bureau of Justice Statistics indicated that in 2011, there were over 400,000 non-fatal firearm assaults, which is a significant increase from the 378,000 incidents in 2010. Non-fatal firearm incidents can result in life-altering injuries, such as traumatic brain injuries, being paralyzed, or simply chronic pain. These injuries may require lengthy hospital stays, piles of hospital bills, inabilities to go to work, and many other things that will affect the day-to-day life of the victims. Mental health concerns, such as depression and anxiety, may also follow as a result of gun violence, which then places more burden on the health and our health professionals. For those of you who are interested in the economic perspective of health, the CDC found that gun-related injuries or deaths accounted for $5.6 billion in hospital bills every year, and $64.6 billion in the loss of productivity as a result. Therefore, not only does gun violence deplete the overall health of the population of the United States, but it places an extreme burden on the healthcare system and the cost of such. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Robin French, and I'm a member of the class of 2014. There are three things I'd like to talk about tonight, two of which directly relate to my major. I'm a math education major. The first doesn't completely relate to it, but it is a cause for concern for me. I believe that the role of the media does not play a positive role in the event of something like Newtown or Columbine. After Newtown, they focused so much on the perpetrator. I'd be willing to bet that the majority of you in this room could name the man responsible for killing those 26 teachers and students that day. They tend to focus less on the victims. I know I'm also very guilty of this assumption that I've made. I could tell you that it was Adam Lanza. I could not tell you one of the victims that was killed. I know the principal was one, but I could not tell you her name. And I'm embarrassed by that. I'm currently working on a project for a sociology class on the role of gun violence in schools with 3 other members of my class. And in our findings, I watched a small clip from a Dr. Phil show when he interviewed some of the Newtown victims. The parents had to put a sign over the doorbell that said, "Please do not ring the doorbell," because their son, who was in one of the classrooms that day, freaked out when somebody rang the doorbell because he was so traumatized and he thought a monster was coming. And another finding of mine, a parent from the Columbine shootings became a licensed counselor to help victims deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. This happened 14 years ago. Today, her daughter is still battling depression and drug addiction. It also took her years to set foot back into the classroom. I believe that the media should focus more on the victims in the short term and in the long term than on the perpetrators. It's not worth it to give them 5 seconds of fame because it turns into hours of coverage. And still, we're hearing about Adam Lanza. I also believe that bullying is a huge cause for gun violence. The Columbine shooters were both bullied. So was the Virginia Tech shooter. Cynthia Lowen recently spoke at Elon and shared her documentary, Bully. While I did not see the documentary in full, I did see a clip of it. And some schools are not addressing the issue of bullying at all. I believe if we address this issue at the root, we might be able to stop it at the core and save the victims and the victims of bullying as well as the people that they made victim as a result. And finally, Dr. Carpenter already touched on this a bit. Teacher defense training. I believe as a teacher I should invest time in becoming a better teacher, not in learning how to operate a gun. While I would do what those Newtown teachers did and protect every single one of my students, I believe that classrooms should be a safe haven for kids, fostering development and growth, and not arming teachers to protect their students. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Zoe Heiberg, and I'm part of the freshman class. The issue of gun control is obviously one of great controversy in today's society. I myself was motivated to join this panel to bring attention to the fact that much of the opinions that the public make are based more on their emotional responses to such horrific occurrences as the Sandy Hook shooting, rather than on the actual facts. Groups advocating for stricter gun laws have painted guns as the enemy, using these violent events to prove that guns are to blame. When something horrific, such as the Sandy Hook shooting, occurs, the public generally wants to find something to blame, something to put to back up why this has happened, and these groups are trying to put it on the guns. They play into the public's emotions in order to gain support, but in reality, guns are not the problem. 2 points that I want to address today. The first one is that the belief that we should be working towards making guns legal in order to decrease violence. The mass killings involving guns that have occurred over the past few years would have occurred whether or not guns were illegal. The people committing such acts are not concerned about going against the law. Instead, they're usually obtaining these weapons illegally in the first place. To continue, the general people would not be able to defend themselves then. The only people who would have these weapons would be the ones that would be doing the damage. Taking away our right to bear arms leaves us in a vulnerable state. We are no longer on the same ground as those who still have the guns, the ones that are abusing the right to begin with. The second issue that I'd like to address is the argument that stricter gun control would prevent accidental gun injuries and deaths. Incidents such as the accidental shooting of the sheriff's wife by the 4-year-old neighbor in Tennessee that happened a couple weeks ago is an example of poor storage of weapons, not the result of gun laws being too lax. The safety was not on the gun, nor were there locks on the gun. To continue, the fact that there were children present and the owner of the gun still decided to take the gun out and show it off are the real reasons why this event happened, not because he owned a gun. Instead of pushing for stricter gun regulations, it maybe would be more beneficial to push for improving laws on how to store a gun, such as requiring safes, maybe on a different area away from the house, in a shed, or in a locked area where children cannot access it and people who are not trained to handle the guns cannot access it. There are many possible solutions to lowering the crime rate, crime rate that is related to guns. However, voting to tighten the laws on guns or making them illegal is not one of them. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Jason Springer. I work here in the Office of Academic Advising. I'm also a member of the National Rifle Association and the American Civil Liberties Union. I belong to these organizations because I believe that at their core, they aspire to limit the reach of government. I've also been a North Carolina concealed handgun permit holder for more than a decade. Additionally, I'm a former firearms blogger and locally competitive pistol shooter. Like many, I own and frequently legally possess firearms for 2 reasons: sport shooting and personal and family safety. For me, firearms rights issues are civil rights issues. Recent Supreme Court decisions Heller and McDonald have affirmed that citizens have the right to possess firearms for lawful purposes, including self-defense. We are and will continue to be a society where private citizens legally own and possess firearms. Within this basic context, there are 2 fundamental questions that I have. One, How do we balance public safety with individual liberty? And 2, what societal ills must we cure to continue to slow the rate of violence? While the Supreme Court will certainly weigh in on legal restrictions to the Second Amendment, let me suggest the following. Number 1, we should look to states for leadership. Trust in the federal government is near historic lows. Citizens have generally favorable views of state government. Elected officials are more accessible and accountable at the state level, and this would address the fact that one size may not fit all. Number 2, we need to focus on the entire problem. What roles do poverty, education, media, parenting, drug policy, mental health policy, and popular culture have on violence? Number 3, we should demand that our elected officials are honest and educated on issues. In early April, the lead sponsor of a federal ban on high-capacity magazines in the United States House of Representatives, speaking at a public forum, clearly had no understanding of how the very magazines she seeks to regulate function. This is just one of many examples of how uneducated lawmakers are misguided in their efforts. Number 4, our anemic media must do some actual reporting rather than simply repeat political talking points. For example, rather than discussing gun show sales and online sales, the majority of which are perfectly legal and require background checks, what the media should be discussing are dealer sales versus private sales. Number 5, we must be restrained with new policies, new fees, and increased bureaucracy. Do we really want to restrict access to firearms from citizens of a lower socioeconomic status through expensive, bureaucratic, and time-consuming licensing procedures similar to those that followed the Heller decision in Washington, D.C.? Do we want to continue to set precedent where individual liberties give way to the concepts of public safety and the greater good? I urge caution when we seek to diminish the rights of the few for the perceived safety of the many. I will conclude by saying this, that if this conversation is only about gun control, the national conversation about gun control, we will have failed completely in the conversation. At their core, I believe that any modifications or additions to current laws made in the name of public safety must defer to individual civil rights. Thank you.
Kind of nervous. I'm Megan Squire. I'm a professor here at Elon. And the reason why I'm speaking here today is because of my personal experience with domestic violence and a question that I have about gun laws. So every day I live with the reality that there is a person living in my community who's acted violently toward me in the past and could do so again. I'm not really sure how to describe to you what that feels like. A judge found cause to grant me a protective order against that person, which is a piece of paper that I have to carry on my body all the time in case there's another incident. And it tells the police how to respond and what has happened before. And that piece of paper also said that that person had to surrender any guns that he had. And it said he couldn't buy any new guns for the duration of the order. In North Carolina, not all protective orders require that gun surrender. It's up to the judge, who bases his or her decision on the pattern of behavior that's occurred. I mean, it's a pretty big deal to take away somebody's constitutional rights, even temporarily, so the pattern of behavior has to be compelling to do that. Anyway, I was glad about that part of the protective order. It's better safe than sorry, right? But I don't really understand all the loopholes in the gun laws, and I was pretty clueless when I first heard about all this. What I didn't realize was that it's actually possible to get a pretty powerful rifle at a gun show without any kind of background check from an unlicensed dealer. And that confused me because it seemed like the law is just saying, we know you can get a rifle at a gun show and we could background check you there, but we're not gonna do that. So just don't get a gun, okay? By not requiring background checks for all purchases, we're just basically hoping that the exact people who can't pass a background check will all of a sudden be level-headed and law-abiding and will restrain themselves. And that just doesn't seem very realistic to me. Why are we okay with this loophole? I just don't understand it. And I should probably add that I don't really want to be standing up here at all, and it's pretty scary to say these things, and it feels awful to think that there's people that might be discounting what I say or blaming me or whatever. But last week, 45 senators voted that his ability to buy a gun illegally is more important than my right to be safe, and I decided that I'm tired of being ashamed of what happened to me and to my family, and I'm going to speak out for those who have it way worse than I do. Ignoring loopholes like this is not fair, and we can do better.
Good evening. My name is Dionna Stanton, and I would like to continue tonight's discussion with a focus on the gender-related and domestic violence implications of gun use. History indicates that a significant incongruence lies in how our culture justifies the stark contrast between the standard of male power with some level of female subjugation. Sex-selective abortions, astounding rates of sexual violence, and unattainable societal expectations for ideal femininity add to the evidence of the gender stratification present in our society. It is no surprise, then, that a link between gun use and violence against women is apparent across the globe. Within the United States, domestic abuse and gender-based violence exist in countless capacities. While we recognize that men and women alike have been and continue to be the unfortunate victims of abuse, rape, and domestic homicide, data shows that females comprise the majority of victims. 25% of the 8,000 females surveyed by the National Institute of Justice reported that they were the victims of such violence by an intimate partner, compared to 7.6% of men who reported the same results. The Coalition for Gun Control reports that women are 3 to 4 more times likely than men to be the victims of spousal homicide. Of all such cases, firearms are the most commonly used weapons. Based on research conducted by Futures Without Violence, access to firearms increases the risk of intimate partner homicide by more than 5 times. Additionally, intimidation by partners with access to guns decreases the chance that victims will pursue opportunities to leave their abusers. It is clear that the possession of firearms by owners and purchasers who have not undergone sufficient screening, as well as those who are not held accountable by some form of regulatory board, further increases the power differential between males and females, thus indicating that the need for more holistic gun control is not only a federal, local, and state issue, but a women's health and social justice issue as well. We owe it to ourselves and to our progeny to work in hopes of eradicating the fear attributed to gun violence. It is imperative that we acknowledge that the great number of homicides and mass deaths that are completed each year with firearms point to the weaknesses in our current system of gun regulation. An imminent change in how the United States and world at large manages violence is necessary for the improvement in the quality of human existence and our collective moral consciousness. Thank you.
Thanks to everyone. That may have prompted questions. So remember, and available to you in the aisles are people to pick up your question cards. So they'll be walking around, just hold them up, and for this next portion, continue to hold up questions as you have them. So we're going to transition now to our invited panelists. And I want one other comment. We are tweeting tonight's event for those online too. It's hashtag EU Gun Debate. So now we turn to our invited guest, and we'll first hear from Reverend Richard McBride, Elon's Distinguished Chaplain Emeritus.
I'm glad to see a good number of folks from the community because you've just seen the kind of conversation that happens in the university setting. Very thoughtful men and women, staff and students who give a great deal of attention to what they want to say and to say it clearly. So thanks to all of you for being here. I do not own a gun except a BB gun, and there aren't any BBs at home. My dad's 2 rifles went to my brother and my son. My son, however, is an Apache helicopter pilot. So if the family needs to balance out, he provides the balance. There are a number of points to take up, but let me just take up the notion of reasonable regulation. Our Second Amendment offers us declares for us that we have the right to bear arms. I think some people only hear that it says that. You may know that it also says in the beginning that there is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now, the Supreme Court in recent decisions has decided 5-4 that the individual right to bear arms is preeminent, whereas the community, the other 4 justices said this is a communal right, that communities would form militias. There's still a debate going on. It's 5-4. We're not unanimous in our view about what this right means. But I want to point to what I believe are some reasonable regulations. One just addressed by one of the speakers is the loopholes that exist that certainly should be closed. Megan's question is just still ringing in my ears. Why would it be possible for a person who has a domestic order against them to be still able to go buy an assault rifle? This just seems absurd on its face, beyond what reasonableness would suggest is necessary. You know, Joe Biden is an interesting guy, and on the issue of magazine clips, when they were talking about whether we might restrict the magazine clip to 10 clips, he said, if you need more than 10 rounds to hunt, and some argue they hunt with that number of rounds, you shouldn't be hunting. If you can't get the deer in 3 shots, you shouldn't be hunting. You're an embarrassment. Well, that strikes me also as a reasonable regulation, that we would limit the size of the magazines that are available to sportsmen. It's not a perfect solution. None of these are perfect solutions, but if they can reduce the possibility of danger to other human beings, why don't we embrace them? The North Carolina legislature at the moment has a bill before it that would allow for guns to be on college campuses within the state university system. That wouldn't apply to Elon. We could still declare against it. But here's the reason why I think that is not a good idea, and it has to do with the impulsivity of youth. Those who study brain development tell us that the part of the brain that governs judgment isn't really fully wired until your mid-20s and late 20s. No wonder teenagers have trouble with impulse control. So if we had more guns available, as last night at Arizona State's fraternity party, rage simply reached for a gun. I don't want more guns surrounding our campus community, so when folks are enraged, they have that sort of weapon to reach for. There are reasonable limits on how much lethality we should have in our communities. I'll just stop with that.
Good evening. I came to Elon in 1978 and graduated in 1983. You can do the math. It's a good place to be. I began my service in law enforcement after graduation, first with the Burlington Police Department. Then I moved to the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, and am currently with the Town of Elon Police Department. In my 30 years in law enforcement service, I know there are people willing to commit violent crimes,